Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion, it's not a straightforward review, it's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening.
Hello, listener. I wanted to give a quick trigger warning for this episode because there is some dark subject matter, including SA or sexual assault. There's also mention of children and death. So it's a heavy movie, and I just want you to walk into this prepared. If this is something that makes you uncomfortable, I strongly recommend avoiding this episode and picking another episode to listen to. For those of you that are still here, it is a good film. I think it explores a lot of interesting themes, and I'll start that now. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up on Twitter or X, you can find me at ILTM Podcast, also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, all one word. And we also have a Patreon. The show is always free, but if you want to support me on there, you can. That's at patreon.com/I Love That Movie. And we have a bonus episode every week of everything else I'm watching, occasionally, some news sprinkled in, as well as some interviews as well. So, join us on there. It's a lot of fun. But let's move on. I've got a returning guest that we've heard a couple times on the podcast. Say hi, Collin.
Hi there.
Hello. So my guest usually, well, actually, before I get into that, why don't you introduce yourself just a little bit in case people haven't heard you on the show before?
Sure. I'm Collin. I'm a film buff. I've been forever since I was as small as I can remember. I loved it when my parents took me to the movies, and I continue to see an inordinate amount of films compared to everyone else I know. And I live in Canada on Treaty 7 territory, and am a big aficionado of Canadian films, which leads into why I picked today's film.
Yes, and that's a good point. Thank you for that introduction, and definitely check out some of Colin's other episodes on the show. But my guest picks the movie. Like a lot of times I get questions like, when are you going to do this movie or that movie? Well, actually the guest picks the movie. And so, yeah, I imagined when I was watching this, there was a specific reason you picked this one, but go ahead and introduce the title.
Yeah, so this is The Sweet Hereafter. It's one of my all-time favorite films, just in general, but it's also one of my two favorite Canadian films. It came out in 1997, right around the time of Titanic. Received quite a bit of acclaim, but as you probably saw from watching it, it's dark and dreary and very sad, and so it certainly has a different sort of audience than maybe some more mainstream films. But it did, as I said, it did very well at Cannes. It did very well at the Oscars. It got a lot of attention, and sort of is considered to be in the top 10 of Canadian movies in general, just it's, for people who follow that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it was really at the height of director Adam McGuigan's career, I think, and really captures a lot of what makes his films so incredible to watch.
Nice. Thank you for that introduction. So I had not heard of this film before. I think it speaks a little bit to what you were talking about, but how ironic that in 1997, the critics loved it, but it wasn't big with audiences, because I think that is the opposite of what happened with Titanic. I remember critics not liking Titanic at first, but then it just took off so much. So it's kind of like, it's just interesting when you look back on a film, like how much things change.
Well, and also they're both about mass tragedies, right?
True.
So there's similar themes there. I just remember at the time the two films having sort of similar qualities, but taking such different approaches.
Yeah.
And I really like Titanic, so
Me too.
I'm not gonna trash on it, but again, this is just a very different sort of a film,
Agreed.
and takes it, which is great. I want all films to be different and take different approaches to things. We get richer and more diverse experiences as movie lovers, right?
100%. You mentioned that it was one of two of your favorite Canadian films. Out of curiosity, what's number one?
So, well, I think I don't know if which one is my favorite, but because I love them both, and I tend not to rank. I tend to avoid ranking. I just
Mm,
sort of like, because films are all different, as I was just saying. I
yeah,
like them for different reasons, right? So sometimes trying to rank them, it feels like comparing apples to oranges, and so
I think
instead,
that's
it's
true.
like children. I just love them all my favorites. They're all my favorites. So this one in Denis Arcand's Jesus of Montreal, the English title is probably the other of my favorite Canadian films. But uh, they're both films that when I watch them, I always get something new out of them. And also there
Yeah.
are moments, especially in this one, that still hit me, every time. Um, and just the power of that after, even though I've seen it, I can't countless times, the emotion still sort of hit me at different points in the film. And it's a big part of why I love watching this very sad and depressing movie.
So when did you first see this sad and depressing movie?
Well, I saw it in theaters. So
Oh, nice.
yeah, I was in college, and when this came out, uh, I was already, as I said, a film buff, so I was following. I'd seen Egoyan's Exotica, which I also love, um, and so I was excited for this one. And I had read the book, which is, not always the case, but I had read this book, so I was really interested to see what he was going to do with it, and then yeah, I just remember just walking out of it, felt like pardon the no pun intended, felt like I was hit by a bus. Just, I sat with it, and it sat with me for a long time afterwards, and just thinking about, and now watching it, now that I'm a parent and I'm older, I think watching it affects me even in different ways than it did when I was young.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, this was my first time actually seeing this movie, as I mentioned before. So, as I was watching it, it sounded like something I had heard about that happened in real life, which is, of course, the case.
Yes.
Happened in Alton, Texas, actually. So, pretty different setting from this movie.
Yes.
But yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just I was going to say that too. I was going to bring this up. I didn't know that. I knew it was based on a novel, but I thought the novel was complete fiction. And I think
Mm,
the fictionalization, the novel itself is a fictionalization of the real story, but it was
yeah, I
inspired
believe
by
so.
and based on a real story that, yeah, happened in Texas. And
Yeah.
that just, I think, in some ways adds to the power. I can't even imagine what it would be like for a small, community like that to be, affected by something like this.
Yeah, well, we've alluded to it a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and read a quick summary. I will say, I mean, this isn't really like a spoiler type film. It's a drama, and you know what happened pretty much right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Or especially at the time that it takes place, people were pretty familiar with this tragedy because it was a big deal. So I'll go ahead and go into the summary now, if you're still with us. And I forgot to mention this at the top, but I watched this movie, if you're in the US, on Film Rising, which was a free service. So definitely go check it out if you can. A small mountain community in Canada is devastated when a school bus accident leaves more than a dozen of its children dead. A big city lawyer, played by Ian Holm, arrives to help survivors and victims' families prepare a class action lawsuit. But his efforts only seem to push townspeople further apart. At the same time, one teenage survivor of the accident, played by Sarah Polley, has to reckon with the loss of innocence brought on about by a different kind of damage. Um, yeah, so like you said before, it's a heavy film. It's based on Russell Banks' novel, which was based on a 1989 bus crash in Alton, Texas, that claimed the lives of 21 children. So it actually even bigger tragedy, I guess, than what's portrayed in the movie, and resulted in a series of lucrative settlements that fractured the community. Just because everybody is so close, and I think they touch on that in the film. I'm sure we'll talk about it. Also, the author Russell Banks went on record saying that this movie he thought was actually an improvement on the novel.
I had heard that too, but I'd forgotten that. Thanks for the reminder. I remember reading that a long time ago. It's nice when like there's often discourse around films based on books, and people say,
Mhm.
"Oh, the book is always better," or the whatever that's adaptation. Like that people will say that some books are unfilmable, and I always push back against that a little bit. I think
Yeah,
that it's a different medium and it can offer different strengths.
sure.
In some ways, the novel might offer certain, experiences and ways of telling the story that are really interesting, and the film might offer different ways of doing that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm a big believer that taking stories and adapting them into different mediums can be an interesting way to to re-experience stories.
Mhm.
And I had read both. I would say I probably prefer the film to the novel as well, but I remember feeling that the novel was also very powerful as well. But we appreciate his comments on that, and I certainly, it's great to know that one artist sort of felt that their work was well handled by another, right?
Yeah, yeah. I like when that happens. Very different from like, say, The Shining.
Right.
But you you mentioned earlier that you really appreciated the director's work, Adam Egoyan. Can you talk a little bit? I hope I pronounced that right, but please correct me. Um, can you talk a little bit about some of his other films? Like, I guess I'm not super familiar with them.
Yeah. So I have some. So Exotica is the sort of his other film that is very famous, and certainly uh, is one of my favorites of his. I'm hot and cold on some of his other ones. Exotica shares some of the cast. It was made like not that this film sort of follows Exotica. It was his next film and has some of the same cast. Sort of, how some directors do that, where they work with many of the same people
Oh
time
yeah.
and again. And there's certainly some of that. I know his wife is in a lot of his films, which again is not an uncommon thing with directors. um, um, so there are
Yeah,
certain
not at all.
films of his that I think there were some sort of attempts for him to go Hollywood that maybe didn't go anywhere or didn't maybe work, like Where the Truth Lies is another one of his with Kevin Bacon and Colin Firth. The uh but I generally find his style to be one that speaks to me generally, even if the movie doesn't necessarily work for me. um the His Guest of Honor film in 2019, it was, I found, really interesting and powerful with David Thewlis. Um, but I don't think anything has really grabbed me as much as either Exotica or The Sweet Hereafter since he made those films.
I'll have to check it out. Well, did you want to talk a little bit about some of the cast of this movie? I mean, the biggest name, obviously, that I noticed right away was Ian Holmes.
Yeah. So the film has, mostly a Canadian cast.
Hmm.
Some big names, recognizable names like Sarah Polley and Bruce Greenwood. Sarah Polley was this child star in Canada before she became a
Oh,
filmmaker herself, which may not be as well known in the U.S. And so she was already fairly well known at the time. I think Bruce Greenwood has become sort of more well known in the it's since this film came out.
yeah.
Um, but Ian Holm, I know originally I think another actor was cast. Was it? I think it might have been. Oh, now I'm forgetting. But Ian Holm, I think, really works in this film. First of all, it's an
Yeah.
incredible performance. I mean, I obviously he's Ian Holm. He's great in so many things. But I think one of the things that being a British actor as opposed with with all of this Canadian cast. I think that
Yeah.
he does feel like an outsider, which I think is so important to the plot of the
Yeah, that's a
film.
good point.
And even though I think he's playing the role. He's not playing a British character in the film. It's not clear. You assume he's also Canadian, but his character is also Canadian, but from the big city. But he does bring that sort of outsider feel to the story, which I think is so important, right? Because so much of
Yeah.
the film's themes tie into the ideas around community
Hmm.
and connection and those sorts of things. And he's dealing with his own problems and his own issues throughout the course of the film. Goyan's films will often play with time in a way that the narrative plays out, where you're watching different moments from different periods of time in a non-sequential order.
I like that. I like that in
Exotica
film.
is definitely like that as well.
Hmm.
And this one, you know, obviously does that very, very much as well.
Does this movie give you a vibe? At first, I couldn't nail it down, but I was watching it yesterday, and I said, "This feels very like indie film in the '90s style of like acting and dialogue." And my husband said, "It kind of seems like a play." And I'm like, "Yeah,
Mm,
it just feels a little bit like a play." Like I could even imagine, you know, some of the monologues that happen or quotes that happen, and then stage left or something,
right.
a light comes out and you see the memory or like it and I guess it speaks to that quality you're talking about where it's the time kind of jumps around. But even the way that people talk almost sounds like a play. I mean, there's poetry in the movie too, and I don't know. It just it had a specific vibe to me.
Yeah, I would say that's very accurate. I think it is very much a talking movie, right? It's
Mhm.
people meeting to talk, which is why in the middle of the film, like everything, as you said, it's not a spoiler that there's this bus accident. You are sort of made aware of that quickly, and certainly the trailers at the time showed that that was the case. So you knew that was coming. Um, and it happens sort of right dead in the center of the film. And when it does happen, it is like a gut punch because so much of the film is people sitting around talking, that when there's actually something, physically happening, it's quite jarring. I think that adds to the effect of the moment and the scene. But they've also managed to build up for you the stakes, right? I mean, on the
Mhm.
one hand, you can say, yeah, it's a bus full of children and a bunch of dead children. And so you obviously think of the stakes right away. But I think when you get to know the people through the scenes first, it becomes even more, more powerful at that moment as well, because you have now you have faces and names and their relationships to the survivors sort of, in your brain and in your feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. I really I felt like it was a movie that it sucks you in and then you sit down and you can't like look away. I wanted to mention too that you talked a little bit about Sarah Polley, just for those listening. She directed Women Talking recently, so I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and won an Oscar for adapted
Hmm.
screenplay.
Hmm. Which I saw that movie. It was really good, but
Yeah, no,
also
it's great.
pretty depressing.
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
I really enjoy her films. I'm a big fan of her movies as well.
Mhm.
And uh, and yes, no, there's a grand tradition in Canadian film of dark, depressing films.
Really? That's like
Oh yeah.
not the impression I have of Canada as a
Well,
nation.
there's two main streams in Canada, like horror and depressing dramas.
Oh,
So
interesting.
very famous. Here, it's sort of famous that Canadian films will be depressing when you go
Yeah,
see them. So yeah, and she definitely lives up to that in the making of her films most of the time.
interesting.
But yeah,
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the film itself. We can start wherever you want. We can go chronologically or pick some of your favorite scenes. What did you want to talk about first?
Let's see. Well, I mean, um, maybe start with the bus accident itself. Like I
Okay.
said, I remember the very first time I saw it, I knew it was coming. They actually showed it in the trailer. They showed
Wow.
the scene with the bus careening out onto the frozen lake in the trailer, and then so you have this in your mind when you're if you've seen the trailer, you have this in your mind that this is going to happen. You know what the film is about, and by the point that it comes, you've already had characters talking about the accident, right? And the way the film structures scenes from before the accident with scenes from after the accident with the scenes of of Ian Holm's character on the plane, which you find out not till the very end is far into the future. Well, not far into the future, but sort of very last chronological sort of
Hmm.
moments from the film. um, you've gotten a sense of the town, who's in it, and who the children are. And Sarah Polly's character, that is central to the entire plot, is also on the bus as well. And so, there's this moment that the father is waving to his children who are at the back of the bus, waving back to him just as it hits the patch of ice and careens off the road and, slides onto the frozen lake. And there's this moment of tension. And I realize it's not very long, but it feels like this, like just moment where time pauses, and then the ice breaks and you see the bus start to slowly sort of sink, and you hear some screams, very muffled, but you hear some screams. And then what you see after that is the father's reaction as he gets out of, he slams on the brakes and he goes running to, up closer, and, just watching, realizing there's little or nothing that he can do. I really appreciate how the film doesn't linger on the details of the moment and more focuses on capturing the feelings of the moment, and just and it's the feelings of those left behind, right? Like that's what this movie is about. It's not about the people who died. It's not about what their experience was, right?
Yeah.
It's about the people who were left behind, either those people who survived it, the bus driver and Nicole, or the parents of the children. Um,
Yeah.
and it just every time I watch it, my heart just sinks in those moments. It's just one of those film moments that will always just be so powerful and so impactful for me.
Hmm.
And I think as I grew older and as I became a parent, it just became even more so.
I'm
um,
sure.
so it's just, yeah, just that moment, of course, obviously is such a centerpiece and central to the whole plot, but the movie is really about so many other aspects of that
Yeah.
tragedy. It's, it could have just been about that tragedy, but it's about, you know, the in many ways it's about the futility of trying to fix things, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much about this film that's about there's nothing that can be done, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I felt like it was really for me, or at least some of the themes that I was thinking about watching it were just grief, and the way how destructive it can be, and how sometimes, knowing quote unquote the truth is not really, it doesn't bring the resolution you think it would. And in a
Hmm.
lot of ways it seemed to start causing even more damage because you're, wondering about the motives of people seeking the truth and what's the
Hmm.
ultimate goal here. Like, can no, you can try to hold someone accountable for this crash, but it was just an accident. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, it was an accident.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just one of those things that nobody nobody's really at fault. It's searching for, but we do that. We search for fault. We search for
Yeah.
blame. We try to think, because that gives us, if we can find that somebody did something wrong, then it means we can control, like we can fix that,
Yeah.
or we can control the world. And so much about this is realizing that we just, bad things are going to happen, right? And
Right.
there's maybe nothing we can do to stop them or fix them.
Mm-hmm.
And that maybe fixing them, as you pointed out, makes things worse.
Yeah.
You get this sense that this town isn't going to be this, isn't going to recover, right? And maybe people will move away, right? Maybe
Yeah.
the
Maybe
community
that's
will.
moving on. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't really get into that, but you certainly get a sense there's not much of a future for this town.
Yeah. It's fracturing relationships within the town actively. And yeah, I mean, it's because they're all so close. Like, it's not like in a huge city where, yeah, there's a bus full of people, but they don't know each other. It's like,
Yeah,
this is worse because everyone knows each other.
right. Yeah,
They
and they
know
all have
everyone's flaws.
interconnections,
Hmm.
and as the film goes on, you find out that the town is, has its issues to begin with, right? I mean, again, the central relationship, again, the movie's dark and depressing. You find out that there's, sexual abuse going on in the town, which is, quite disturbing and quite yeah, upsetting. The sort of that veneer. One of the things that I think I've come to understand about the movie, or the way that I read the movie as I watch it now, that maybe I didn't so much when I was watching it before, is that I find that the film maybe is presented as remembrances more than documenting events, so that the way we're seeing things is the way the characters are remembering them, perhaps more than maybe how they actually happened. Like, I remember thinking this when I was watching, like in that scene leading up to the bus accident, where the children are waving at the dad and the dad's waving at the children, and it sort of goes on for a bit, and it feels
Yeah.
a little unreal. It feels a little over the top sweet and sentimental. And then I
Yeah.
started thinking about the way that character, Bruce Greenwood's character, would play that event over in his mind, right?
Yeah.
In the future. And I started thinking about many of the ways, and that the film maybe is showing us how people are remembering it more than how, like, at least in certain parts, right? How people are remembering it more than maybe how it actually happened. A lot of those flashbacks to scenes with the kids feel rosy and feel quite idyllic.
Yeah.
And even with Sarah Polly reading the, sort of that those scenes of Sarah Polly reading the story to the children that are sort of interlaced throughout the story, it feels like the film might be, it, it might be presenting us with feelings more than facts, if that makes sense, if I'm expressing what I'm trying to say here very well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think, especially to me, the beginning of the film, like when Ian Holmes when he's in the car wash and he
Right.
gets that call and then he gets out and then he sees the bus, like that part felt very dreamlike to me. I was like, is this happening or did he die? Like, is
Right.
this going to be a Jacob Ladder scenario? He was on the bus. Like, at first that really kind of threw me, but I think it speaks to the dreamlike quality of the film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially with, with the story between Sarah Polly's character and her father, and as you find out that there's sexual abuse happening, and the way
Yeah.
that that's presented, it's again, you would wonder if it's more about the characters sort of remembering, remembering things in a way that is less. Not that I'm not trying to suggest that I don't think the abuse happened, but I think there's, sort of a way that as a survivor of something like that, that she might be trying to, like, her memories around it may be, couched in different kinds of conflicting emotions that she might be feeling, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think she both loves her father but is obviously reckoning with some of these emotions. But it's not presented in a way that it typically is, where it's just, you know, focused on the trauma, but more like, I don't want to, okay, I don't know how to phrase this, but like
I
there's
know, it's so
with,
difficult, isn't it?
yeah, there's that scene with her and him in the barn. And I mean, they seem like a regular couple. Like
Yeah,
it's almost idealized, like he's a cool older
yeah,
boyfriend, but it's her father.
I
It's just
know.
it's really, really dark.
It is very
Yeah.
dark. It's so dark, and because there's candles everywhere, and I remember thinking, "What a fire hazard this is!" It's
Oh,
like
that's
hay
true. I never
everywhere.
thought about that. But yeah, yeah.
But
I mean,
but
it's. I even like I was watching it and I was getting confused watching it at first. I was like, "Wait, isn't that her dad?" Like it took me a while to like really understand what the movie was kind of trying to say. I
right.
almost feel like maybe you could view it too as his memory of it. Like,
That's right, and I'm not sure
yeah,
how we're filtering those things through, right?
yeah, like
But
he's romanticizing and maybe
that's right,
justifying and leaving out because there nothing, even though there's some images that you're like, well, this isn't okay, it
right,
never goes all the way with it. So
right.
you're kind of like, did it happen? Did it not happen? I feel like that both the victim and the predator probably view it that way. Like it's traumatizing, just like the bus crash,
Yeah,
just traumatizing. Yeah.
that's right, that's right. And then all of the scenes sort of post bus crash with their relationship and just how fractured it is, and just how uh and then of course um her choice at the end of the movie to lie.
Hmm.
I mean, I think it's so interesting because so much of her youth has been based on a lie, right? It's based on lying ways. You find out more of that. So how easy
Yeah.
that is to come to her, for her to be able to do that. But also, it's a way for her to, I think, free herself from her father and what he's been doing to her all this time. It's
Yeah.
just, it's so powerful and complicated. I think that's one of the things about this movie that I appreciate so much, is just how the complicated way that it wrestles with what are really difficult and really dark, feelings and events, right? That
Yeah.
that it just really brings such a powerful and non-conclusive. I mean, it would have been easier to do things in a more straightforward way, where maybe she just you know stands up to her abuser, accuses him. I don't know, like there's a number of different ways that this could have happened, but instead she makes the choice that she does
Yeah.
to sabotage the lawsuit.
Yeah, but
um
the lawsuit too, like, I wonder if she's coming to terms with who he is because
yes,
it's, obviously very self-serving and greedy. It's like he should be more concerned that his daughter is paralyzed now, and instead he's seeing it as like a get rich quick opportunity. I mean, that's really
hmm
messed up. And so, yeah, her sabotaging him makes sense, but also it's concerning because then the blame is gonna shift to the bus driver who didn't do anything. It
right.
like you said, it's complicated.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the movie tries to sort of set up a bit, the script sets up a bit that that nothing will happen to her because she
Yeah,
doesn't have anything that anyone could go after. She's a working woman who probably has lives paycheck to paycheck, and the movie even gives you Dolores is okay at the end of the movie,
that's
right?
true.
Like they give you this glimpse into where she ends up, and she seems like she's okay, maybe isn't the right word, like that she's fine.
Well, she's
Whether
still working for
that's
sure,
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Whether she'll ever recover from that event either, I mean, who knows, right? Like,
Yeah.
but her story is complicated too. The I'll say one more thing about, because it is such a difficult aspect of the story and such an uncomfortable place to go and think about. And you think of think about Nicole, her character, Sarah Polly's character, and all
Yeah.
that she's gone through. It's so upsetting. But there's a certain amount of, you can see again post bus accident that she's potentially finding her she's finding her escape. Like
Yeah.
she probably idealized her father before, and as you said, like in some twisted and sick way, was maybe in convincing herself that she was in love with him or something like that, and she's
Yeah. Well,
now
it also
seeing
went with
him.
her rock star dream that he was
Yes.
stoking as well, of like, "Oh, you're so special and unique and different, and you're
Yeah.
gonna be a singer." And it's like, again, all of that was kind of used to manipulate her. And
Yes.
she's realizing that, especially now that her life has taken such a dramatic turn.
That's right. That's right. And she now sees maybe more clearly, maybe she's growing up a bit, and now she understands maybe some of, what's wrong with everything. And he appears to be aware that he might be losing his grip on her, and is
Yeah.
frightened. You could certainly, he comes off very different in those moments of the movie compared to sort of the pre-bus crash
Yes.
scenes. Um, and you can tell he's afraid of her, and the power that she has, or starting to find for herself, maybe, right? So she finds a
100%.
voice. Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
haven't mentioned this yet, but it sort of parallels Ian Holm has a really difficult relationship with his daughter.
Yes.
And he also has several memories in the film that I think play into that dreamlike quality you talked
Yes.
about. He keeps remembering a moment, a morning with his daughter and his
Yes.
wife, and they're in bed, and it's beautiful. It looks like a painting. But you're kinda like, "I'm sure it didn't look like that. It wasn't
Right.
probably that ideal."
That's
But,
right.
this town has lost all their children, a lot of children, and he's lost his daughter in a certain way. And, I mean, he doesn't
Yes.
have an abusive relationship with his daughter, but it's still twisted in
Yeah.
some ways because of her addiction. So,
Yeah. I do
it's sort of,
wonder,
yeah.
that also played into my theory that, again, it's sort of, I don't know if unreliable narrator is the right term here, but that the film is more impressionistic about the events than it is about,
Yeah.
sort of historical accuracy. As much as you can say that about a fiction story, but you're right, those are his memories from the farthest back ones, which are the most dreamlike because they are the furthest back in time, of him with his infant daughter, who he's you know basically presented with this awful scenario of, you're going to have to potentially have to stab into your daughter's throat to save her life.
Yeah.
And just the impossible nature of such a conundrum, right?
Yeah.
And the fear, the lack of control, like, again, comes back to these things. Like, there was this time when my daughter was an infant, maybe, yeah, I think, yeah, when she was an infant, where there was one day where I'd never had a panic attack in my life, but I had one, that probably maybe incident that was as close to that as possible. It was this one moment early, very early into her life, when I couldn't stop thinking about all of the horrible things that could potentially happen, right?
Oh
That I
gosh.
could have no control over. And I finally
Yeah.
calmed myself down, but so much of this movie speaks to those kind of feelings, right? Like, this
Yeah.
is about parents who just have no ability to save their children. And his story is the most complicated of all, because it's not just one incident that nobody was able to do anything about. It's this whole pattern, like, from going back to this one memory that he has of her as an infant, but then now dealing with her as a young adult, and seeing her, because this, you have to remember, in the late 90s, people who became HIV positive still often died, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not like today, where we have treatments for people, and people are able to live fair, normal lives,
Yeah.
who are HIV positive. So he knows that or he believes that she's going to die. Maybe, again, maybe she didn't, but
Again, unreliable narrator. We
yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
Is this a way to control him?
Yeah, that's right.
Or,
Yeah.
and what a horrible, horrible thing to
Yeah.
do, right? But at the same time, it's like you said, the time period, a lot of fear
Yeah.
and not a lot of answers that we have now, thankfully,
Hmm.
where people can live completely full lives
Yeah.
and be okay. Back then they couldn't, and there was so much stigma, and there's a lot of stigma around what his daughter is doing, you know, the way her lifestyle, you would say, in terms of like the drug use and things like that. There's a lot of judgment that comes along with that too.
Yeah.
So it's like
Yeah.
just all kind of wrapped up in this really complicated, he doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And even like both the daughters are blonde. I don't know. There's just like a lot there.
Yeah.
I also, I don't think we talked about this relationship yet, but what do you make of the relationship with the like the hippie parents and I think their son's name was Bear?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So that's, interesting too. I think there's, it's, so the actor playing the mother in that couple is the wife of the director. I'm not sure if
Oh,
I
okay.
believe they're still together. I don't know
Oh,
that
nice.
for sure, but I believe so. Yes, that's right. Just checked Wikipedia.
So far, so good.
That's right. So yeah, no, it's always nice when you see Hollywood marriages like stay
Yeah.
together. I guess it doesn't happen very often.
That's true.
Um, so yeah, I mean that the film doesn't get too much into that. I like how the town, the characters that we get to meet in the town get to be fairly well drawn out. They're not as like, there's certain characters we focus on a lot
Sure.
more, but you do get some, you get some sort of idea of the town. As I was saying, like there's, it's like and in the way that like David Lynch, for example, will often do like sort of the darkness underneath the surface of the idyllic, sort of small town life, right? There's a lot of that going on here too, right? And whether it's the affair, you find out about the affair that's going on, or with this couple, they what I find interesting about it is there's they clearly are, they adore their child. We don't get their backstory. We don't know why they adopted. We don't know what his
Yeah.
backstory is. You don't know if he has any sort of connection, to the community where he would have come from or not. But there's certainly, but you see them, like they're the ones that I think they're the ones that the lawyer goes to first, which is interesting because you wouldn't perhaps expect them with their, sort of with the kind of maybe assumptions we might make about their lifestyle would be the ones that would, sort of sign on to a lawsuit, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's even a moment where the where Ian Holmes is questioning the bus driver, and he's like, talk about them, and she
Yes.
does, and he's kind of like, oh, so like, is there something wrong with them, or like, and she's like, no, 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 really quickly, which again, like, I think speaks to kind of how when something like this happens, it's like every little aspect of everyone's life is like under a microscope now,
Yes. Yeah. 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 But I
but
also
yeah,
like how, like, it really captured, like, I know it's just sort of very sort of quick, but there's, that um this is a very sort of generally homogenous town, small town, and so it's
mhm.
set in British Columbia, and it's sort of in a small mountain town, so it's fairly homogenous there. You don't get it's interesting, like even Dolores, that she makes her sort of like white person comment about how, what a beautiful child he was, in the way that sort of white people
Yes,
will often
okay.
overcompensate to say, well, look, I'm not
Yes.
racist.
Exactly, and, like, those weird, like, pictures of him without a
Yeah.
shirt, like, the photos where
Yeah, yeah,
it feels a little colonial, like,
yeah,
it feels
totally.
very much like, "Oh, look at us, we adopted this,
Yeah,
indigenous person, but we think he's so beautiful," and it's like, "That's
exactly.
cringy,"
Yeah,
like,
it
there's
really was.
something going on with their relationship with their son felt off, but, again, you said that there's a theme, throughout the movie of, like, idyllic town, but then underneath it, like, there's
Yes,
just all these complicated, weird things, and so, I felt like that had to have been intentional, like, the way they portrayed them, so yeah.
yeah, I agree. I believe so, and I also think, like I said, there's something in that scene where Ian Holm comes to them and tries to convince them, and you can just see the pain they're struggling with, right? And the just the
Yeah.
insurmountable pain, and how they get, it's almost like a temptation. It's almost like a corruption scene, right? Like
Hmm.
he's come in there, and is corrupting them, right? And how they succumb to it and give up maybe what they betray their own values about what, how they want to live their lives to, sort of participate in getting this, whether it's revenge or maybe they feel like they can get some sort of solace or something. If somebody can be held, again, like what I was saying before, if someone can be held accountable, then maybe there's a bit of relief to the pain that they just don't know how to deal with.
Yeah, I think that would be very normal for parents to, at least in the beginning, they're very vulnerable, right? Like
Yes.
somebody swoops in and says, "Oh, well, your son died, but don't worry, we're going to like punish someone and that's going to give you justice." And so,
Right.
yeah, they're very vulnerable to that because of that. But it's like, is that real justice? And is that person telling them that? Like, what's their motive? It's just really complex,
Yeah.
like you said.
So I didn't say this in my introduction, but I'm a lawyer, and I do find, like, so lawyers are common in movies, right, or
Hmm.
TV shows, and I do find presentations to be so interesting because there is, I definitely feel like I find myself, um, how do I say this, following, sort of evaluating the the morals and ethics of the
Yeah.
lawyer characters in films, right? Like I find myself relating or not relating, or learning about, maybe taking away bits of how, what I feel like my responsibility is in my role.
Yeah, you can't help but apply it to yourself. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so, whenever if I'm watching lawyer TV shows, or, and I mean, you always have to, like, ask yourself too, like, how, like, did that's not how that works, or whatever.
Yeah,
But
you probably
there's always a
notice
lot
more
of that.
because of your job, yeah,
Yeah,
than others
exactly.
might. Like, that wouldn't
I
be
always
legal.
joke that the most unrealistic part of any lawyer TV show is the fact that they, like, say, "Well, I'll see you in court," and then the next day that's where they are. It's like, no, it's like nine
As opposed
months
to, like,
from
a
now
year
if you're
later, yeah,
lucky. Yeah.
right.
But yeah, no, I did find myself again rewatching this, because I wasn't a lawyer when I first saw this movie, and now I am. Um, so rewatching this and really thinking about his professionalism, thinking about, or lack of, thinking of the
Mhm.
choices that he's making, evaluating, judging, being, but also, I think the film gives you some grace for him, some space to give him grace as well,
Yeah,
because you understand the pain that he's going through, and you do wonder how much of this is caused, but, like, he we don't know what his relationship was like with his daughter when she was young, right?
exactly, like,
Was
was
he
there trauma
absent?
there,
Yeah.
Like, we don't know why. Maybe that's part of why she became addicted. We just
Yeah.
have no idea.
Yeah, maybe that's why she's lashing out at him, because this is the only way she's been able to get him to pay attention to her. Or, I mean, clearly he's made a choice. And again, we're seeing his memories of these conversations. Like, maybe maybe he's remembering them differently from how they happened, right? Even even the scene on the airplane, like, there's such this contrast. Like, the woman he's sitting next to, yeah, at first she just seems like this. She seems very professional, right? And very, very adult. And when you find out, oh, she's a friend of his daughter's, like, they went to school together. She's,
Yeah,
basically, the age of his daughter. You, you but at the difference between how his daughter is presented in the movie, and how this
mhm,
very, well dressed and very articulate young woman who's sitting next to him in business class on the plane, it appears to be, um, they, you see what, yeah, you see what could have, maybe what could have been, or, how different people's lives go, and,
yeah,
or again, maybe how he's perceiving it, right? How he's
mhm,
perceiving this person that he's run into on the plane, and is having this very difficult conversation. At first he attempts to just sort of, make small talk and not get into it, but then eventually he gives into, really narrating so much of the pain that he's feeling, right? he's made this choice to sort of have tough love with his daughter. Again, you wonder, maybe that's how he always was with her. Maybe that was
Right.
his approach, and maybe that pushed her away. Who knows, right? But what we know is that he's lost his daughter in so many ways. I mean, I get the impression that is he flying to see her, or having seen her? Like,
Yeah.
again, there's so many ways you can interpret it. I've had different, like, why is he on this plane? I've had different thoughts about it. Is he flying because he's going to where she is, and he's going to find her and try to help her? Is he flying home after having tried to do that unsuccessfully, right?
Yeah.
There's just, I don't know. I think you could look at it a number of different ways, and the film leaves you those spaces to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things left open-ended. I feel, we talked a little bit about the bus driver. She's also got, her husband at home
Yes.
who is I guess has suffered maybe a stroke, or I forget if they say in the film.
Yeah, I don't know if they do. That's a good question. I don't remember if they do, but clearly she is caring for him.
Yeah, she's a caretaker. So again, it's like, what, you want to punish someone needs to pay. Who? This poor woman that is a caretaker to her husband, who's, like you said, is living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, earlier in the film, they're like, oh, she was going a little bit too fast. And that's what the daughter, sort of says at the end. But it's kind of like, okay, like, so if a bus goes over 50 miles an hour, that explains why it crashed. Like, it still doesn't really
Well,
mean anything at the end
I
of the
believe
day.
she's lying. I believe
Oh yeah,
Nicole is
she for
lying.
sure
Yeah, I
is.
don't think
Yeah.
Dolores was driving too fast. I mean, it was a patch
Yeah.
of ice. Like, again,
Yeah.
any Canadian knows that they can just come out of nowhere. There's the patch of
Yeah.
ice. Things happen, right? The guard, like, could a guardrail have stopped a bus that, when it hits it at that angle? Like, I just don't. Yeah, there's, like, I don't, when he's talking about, when he's trying to convince the autos that
Yeah.
about that somebody should pay, that there's, someone didn't screw in a bolt properly. There's nothing about that
Yeah.
bus, that its construction, that could have stopped it from going over the edge.
100%. And you're gonna
Or,
sit here and tell me that bus
yeah,
drivers never accidentally go a little bit over? Like, I
yeah,
mean, it's no one's fault. I was
no,
actually reading about the crash it's based on, because I'm like,
yeah,
such a good, I'm not gonna say excuse, but a good, I guess, part of the story that makes it very convincing is the ice. Whereas in Texas, there isn't
right,
ice, but
right.
I was reading that in the original story, there was like I guess a mining ditch or something, like an
Oh,
excavation, and it had rained a lot and it filled with water, and the bus
mm.
went into that. And
Okay.
so that's why people weren't able to get out, but also, like, I guess they didn't have time, like, the whole bus filled up with water in seconds. Obviously, the water's not clear, it's not a lake.
No,
And
right.
so it's, like, straight up and down, and so only the children at the back of the bus were able to get out. I guess the bus held, like, 84 people, which is
Oh, wow.
huge, but,
Yeah,
like, 21 of them died, but the rest of them actually did get out.
right,
Um, but still, it's like, yeah, like, how, and then so a lot of the lawsuits were about, like, well, this ditch shouldn't be there,
right,
full of
right,
water, like, that's somebody's fault. And there's just, like, a bunch of little things that are, they kind of are someone's fault, but still, like, even if they're safety hazards, who could possibly predict that this would happen, though? That's really strange, right? Like, they were
right,
like, oh, the bus should have had better exit points and,
right,
bigger
right,
windows, and it's like, sure, all that's true, but when has this ever happened
right.
before? And when will
Yeah,
it ever happen again? Like you're saying, it's like, there's, sure, you can find flaws, but I don't think that any of that explains this. It's just a freak accident, essentially.
right. I do believe that the movie and the book, if I remember, it's been a long time since I've read the book, but I feel like they try to communicate in this story that there really is nothing that could have been done, right? That it
Yeah.
really is about, the futility of trying to impose order in, or try to get justice in, in a horrible situation that there just is no justice for, right?
Yeah. And forcing people to, like, relive their trauma, like his daughter or,
Yeah,
his friend that's like, "Oh, so you're gonna make me get up there
right.
and talk about it even though I told you I don't want to, and I'm trying to move on,"
Yeah,
and he's like, "Well, I'm not gonna do that," and it's like, "Yeah, but I'm going to have to do that." Like, you're so again, it's like creating even more trauma out of trying to find, quote, unquote, "the truth" and
that's right.
questioning people's motives, and yeah, it's
Well,
really
and I think
layered.
that's interesting that, there is this theme of sexual abuse going on as well, because that's just, I mean, also in terms of trying to seek justice for the justice system handles that issue of sexual abuse and sexual assault so poorly,
Mm.
and re-traumatizes people, re-traumatizes victims. Um, it really plays into the themes of this movie, and the way that the attempts to fix things make things worse. What were your feelings about the Pied Piper references? What were your
Yeah, I
thoughts on
noticed that,
that
there's a lot of
comparison?
imagery about that. I mean, I guess I kind of assumed at first it was just like, this lady was someone that all the children liked and she felt like she was taking care of them, and then instead she kind of led them to their death by via the crash. I wasn't I don't know. How
Mhm.
do you interpret it?
Well, I think it's about, so the story is about loss of children, right? So the Pied Piper leads the children away, I think, in the original story. And so it is about, that kind of loss, and also about there's something about in community, like when the children die, it's sort of like in the film Children of Men, another film that I love, like this idea of what possible future is there if there are no children, right? Like that is how sort of life goes on. That's how communities, survive, is that, through the generations. And so with all the children dead, does that mean that the community has died? And I mean, I definitely feel like the movie is saying that, right? That like the movie is called The Sweet Hereafter, and she has that line near the end where she talks about how we're all citizens in this, in this new town, this, the Sweet Hereafter. And it's almost implying that, not in a Jacob's Ladder way, but in a, this is now, these are now, like,
Yeah,
the
like the
town is
people
dead.
are the Walking Dead
Yeah,
essentially. I mean, they've lost so much. The whole town is going to be changed forever.
that's right. And Ian
Yeah.
Holmes' character is too, like, with his
Yeah.
loss of his daughter, he's almost, in a way, he's dead too, right? He's been,
Yeah. She's like
um,
a ghost to me, just calling
yes,
and haunting him and tormenting him, basically.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, very much
Yeah.
so. And the way she's presented too, because we only get
Very
these little
yeah,
glimpses. Yeah.
very one-dimensional, character.
Yes.
She's not, we don't know anything about her except that this is upsetting him,
Right.
essentially, yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point.
I wanted to talk about the score as well. I
Oh,
love Michael
sure.
Dana's score. So he's, obviously a very prolific composer. He did Life of Pi. Um, he did Time Traveler's Wife. Or Adoration. Like, there's a number of Little Miss Sunshine. He's done, quite a bit of many films. And but I this is one of my favorites of his. I just love the, like, it's got, like, so there's the Pied Piper reference, and then there's a lot of flute in the score. I just love the feeling of the music. It just feels so like, I like it when a score and a movie just really feel so integral to each other, and I feel like that's the case here. The other thing is that, again, probably wouldn't be as recognizable to American audiences, is that um, there's a couple of songs. The one in particular, "Courage," that Sarah Polley's character sings, um, is a huge Canadian song. Like, it was I think it would have been in the 80s. Or early 90s that song came out, and it was like, Canadians would all know it, right? Like, would all know the words. So hearing, and then she does this cover of it that is very different and has this ethereal quality to it. um I just remember really being impacted by hearing that song in that way. The original song is played later in a scene, I think when he's carrying her up the steps to the when she's going to be questioned.
Yeah.
But it's definitely for Canadian audiences. It would be like that song when you hear it
Oh,
you'd know it right away, right? Like it would
wow.
be a cover of like some big song, and you would hear it. And then there's another song is also
Interesting.
another song by Canadian artists. But again, like her takes on them are very different, and they have this almost ghostly sound to them, right? The way that her character sings these songs in the movie.
Yeah. And I feel like that's also very indicative of the time. Like I feel like,
Right.
that sort of style of pop, which I feel like it has only increased since then.
Right.
When you look at someone like, I don't know, Billie Eilish, or I don't know, Grimes, or other pop stars that sing in this sort of like haunting and different way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like kind of started getting really popular around this time. So
Right, right.
a great
Yeah.
time capsule movie if people are, I feel like a lot
Yes.
of people are so in love with the 90s, like a good movie for that for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, but if you ever if you ask any, so the name of the band is called the Tragically Hip. There, if you ask any Canadian, they'll know it's one of the biggest bands here that never really translated outside of this country. So it's one of those
Ah.
bands that is like beloved by Canadians, and huge here. Like they would fill stadiums here, but they actually, my partner actually saw them at a bar in DC one time, and it was just in like
Oh,
a
wow.
little bar where you could like almost like walk up to the stage, whereas here you would like be in a stadium like lined up, like. So there were definitely uh one of those it definitely had. I think that you know as a Canadian watching this film, it speaks to me in a number of ways because the setting. I mean, I live not super far from where it was shot. I spent a lot of time in areas like around there. Um, winter driving, like you just the like things that you just relate to, right? So strongly, the music, those sorts of things. It just really has that sort of quality where you feel like, okay, this feels very familiar. This feels very much like something that, even though it's a dark and troubling story, and there's so much emotion to it, at the same time it also just has this sort of feel where it feels very recognizable, I think, for a Canadian audience, very much about it. And again, at the time, Sarah Polley was less of a international figure and more like I said, she was a child star here and was very well known. And so again, that would have played into it. So with the choice of the music and her and things like that and the setting, I think all of that just really really resonated at the time. There's I think sometimes because the story was actually an American novel that
Yeah.
he transposed to a Canadian setting, I think it still works universally.
I think so. I honestly feel like the ice aspect of it makes it, this sounds crazy to say because it actually happened, but more believable. Like, I
mm,
think what happened in reality sometimes, is stranger than fiction, right?
yes,
So, like,
that's
I
right.
think I think there's
That's right.
something about, like, this is a little town out in Canada, and it's kind of isolated, it's icy, it's small. Like, I think the setting plays a lot into that.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes you're right. Like people, joke about how, oh, you could never, tell that story because nobody would believe you. Like when they're talking about real stories, because often it is stranger than fiction, right?
Yeah, 100%. Is there anything else, that we haven't touched on in regards to this film that you wanted to talk about?
I just, I mean, I think the cast is amazing, but I just,
Yeah,
Ian Holm blows me away in this film. Like,
yeah.
and again, he's always good. um, but I mean, it's definitely such a loss that he's not with us anymore. He's such an incredible
Yeah.
actor, and this may be my favorite of his performances. I just find it so powerful and so moving, and he's unlikable and sympathetic at the same time,
Yeah.
and relatable, but also in ways that you don't necessarily feel good about, right? Like I just everything that he does, like he doesn't ham it up, like it doesn't feel like, there's more, like he doesn't have like a big dramatic scene, but he just does so much, and because he's so restrained, and it just fits with the character. Anyways, I just wanted to say how incredible Ian Holmes' performance is in this film.
100%. Totally agree. I think it's probably one of the best performances I've seen of his. So yeah, I would agree with that. Well,
Yeah.
if that sounds like we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation here, so I want to ask you my last couple of questions that I typically ask. Number one being, and you've talked about it for during this discussion, but what about this film, if you had to summarize it, keeps you coming back?
Well, again, I think as I've aged, it's the kind of film that as you get older, it resonates perhaps more for you in terms of loss. I don't think you necessarily have to be a parent to feel that. I think that as you grow, you just inevitably in life there's loss, and so that really resonates for you. I think the impact, the emotional impact of reflecting on the futility of being able to fix things so that and the exploration of how you just have to wrestle with pain and loss, and all of that is so meaningful and powerful.
Yeah. If you had to describe this film to someone, you're sort of plugging it saying, "Hey, watch one of my favorite 2 Canadian films." What would you say?
Well, I'd say that and I felt like I maybe should have warned you as well, but I feel like you see so many films, you're probably prepared for, sort of anything. But I do often tell people, it's going to be an emotional impact. So,
Yeah.
be ready for that. It's not a light film. So just,
Right.
if you're not in the mood or if you're not, in the headspace where you can watch something, that's sad and impactful, then, hold off.
For
So I would
sure.
warn people about that. But I would say it's such a rich experience. Like it's really gives you a lot to to feel, and it gives you and not in a just like, it's not a, oh, I'm going to sit here and cry. It's not a tearjerker sort of a movie, right? It's the
Right,
emotions
right.
that it's dealing with are much more sort of complex or difficult than that, right? Like it's dealing with
Mhm.
anger, and it's dealing with resentment and grief, and and frustration, lack of power. Like, so there's so many things it's dealing with, and it's going to make you uncomfortable, and it's going to make you think about things that aren't fun to think about. So,
Mhm.
but that can be a really rich and rewarding experience, and I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but
Sure.
I like films that make me think about things that are difficult to think about.
Me too. Well, Colin, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure having you. I hope to have you back soon. Is there anything you want to plug before you leave?
No, not necessarily. I just
Okay.
thank you again for having me. It's
Yeah.
always so much fun to talk about movies, and I hope that this will inspire some people to go out and find this, if because it is a film that I worry sometimes is slipping into slipping out of the public consciousness. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping that some people will find it and give it a rewatch, and maybe check out some of his other films as well, especially Exotica.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colin. Hope to have you back soon.
Thank you.